Welcome to the Envision RISE podcast. I'm your host, Staci Hegarty, COO of Envision RISE. Joining us today is the founder of Changing Paces International, Lori Pace. Those of you who have been with us for a while may recognize Lori from a previous podcast. And today we are, first of all, excited to announce our strategic partnership between Envision RISE and Changing Paces International. Welcome, Lori. I'm so glad you're here.
Glad to be here, and I'm thrilled about our partnership.
This is going to be exciting. So why don't you first talk a little bit about Changing Paces International to either refresh our listeners or introduce yourself to them for the first time?
Wonderful. So Changing Paces International really was born out of the idea of finding ways to work and align with organizations that were looking to become more multicultural so that they can really start working in a global sense and global mindset. And so as a consulting firm, we work with different industries to help them with that process and introduce training opportunities so that people can not only create a succession plan, but also look at the next generation for ensuring that we are accommodating or they are accommodating the needs that are continuously changing through our different markets.
All right. Well, Lori, you and I met at our kids' school. I think it was a Black History Month show. And we got to talking a little bit about what our companies do and the struggles that we have been seeing, as well as some of the victories we've been having. And you and I have talked a lot about how this is no longer about diversity, equity, and inclusion. Those words don't mean anything to anyone anymore and have even taken on kind of a negative connotation in a lot of aspects.
So to your point, it still has meaning, but in a different way now because it's become divisive. It's been used almost as a weapon as opposed to an opportunity to make change for the best.
And, I think what we really are talking about here is strategic workplace culture. This isn't about hiring a certain number of X demographic for your organization. That doesn't work. We're not talking about quotas. We are talking about transformative change within your organization to allow you to not only reach your strategic goals, but also to do it in the context of an inclusive workplace culture that encourages people to be innovative, to take risks, to be willing to fail. So let's talk about what are you seeing that organizations are doing for a strategic workplace culture?
So lately, what I've noticed is that people are trying to adjust to what does that mean? What does their culture mean? How are they defining it? And in many cases, the culture of pre-pandemic has changed significantly in how people do business and how people interact with each other and how they work in the workplace. In some cases, that being remote at conferences, sometimes it even includes making it so that they can do multiple platforms so that it can be done virtually. So that culture in itself has changed the dynamics of how people work together because they're now working in new circumstances and they've had an opportunity to stretch their imagination. Things that people thought were impossible for creating a culture or work culture has now become the norm. And that has now allowed people to say, well, if that's the case in how we work in terms of physically being in the room together and you can now do it virtually, what does that mean for the different types of individuals that are part of this organization? So now people are not so much afraid of the idea of change, but now figuring out how do we do it so it's sustainable? Because much like we talked about with DEI, people changed their mission statements. People hired several new individuals that checked the box, and then they had to figure out how do those people incorporate themselves with the organization and how is the organization embracing them. So the greatest changes that I have seen is people be willing to adjust frequently to be able to meet the needs of what's happening in the organization and their relationship with their clients.
I'm glad you brought up the pandemic piece of it and how so many of us learned to work from home really quickly. Now, I've got a different situation. We have always been remote at Envision RISE. So the pandemic wasn't a big deal for us in that way. But for a lot of our clients, a lot of our partners, it was a really big change. And it happened so fast. It was literally Friday, you came home from the office, and Monday, you were trying to figure out Zoom.
Yes. Yes. And the irony is being a woman of color, that's how I have felt in regards to diversity, equity, inclusion. This is everyday life for me and for my
Mhm.
colleagues and my family and my children. And for others, they're now, for the first time overnight, having to address sensitivities around it. And that's angered people in some senses because they feel as though they have to walk on eggshells, or what do I call you? How do I refer to you? And for me, I've always had to make that adjustment and be a chameleon. And so the good news, and I look at that time that we all had to change as saying, welcome to my world. And like you said, for some, this is the first time they've ever had to actually articulate their feelings or even recognize the blind spots that they had. And for people like myself, is finding ways to make that comfortable for people so that it's not combative. So it's not saying, well, I've been doing this all along, you just deal with it. It really is, how can we deal with it together and make it so that it's not a change, but it becomes consistently what you do is being more conscious and more aware.
And I think a lot of this burden of cultural transformation and change hasn't been dealt with well. And it sort of became this, well, figure it out thing. And by the way, this is how we do things now, figure it out. And people were left with a lot of questions, and people don't deal well when they're feeling fearful, when they're going into new space, whether that's physical space or emotional space. How can we work with leaders to get them to not only understand that it starts with them, but to actually do some of those hard things that are going to really make a difference for the entire organization? Because if you don't see the C-suite walking the talk, you're not going to do it. You're going to feel
Correct.
like, oh, it's just this thing that they feel like they had to do. And they keep talking about strategic culture, they keep talking about transformation, but really they just want me to say a couple of special words and have that be it.
There's no question that leaders were challenged during these last few years, recognizing that the burden and the opportunity is not on them. And that while they're leading the charge, that they are having to rely 100% on their teams. And their teams have to be trained, they have to be conscious, and they have to be willing to work together differently. And different is actually the one thing that stays consistent. And so leaders are now finding that their skill sets have been forced to change. And what brought them to the level of leadership is not enough anymore, that they have to do more. So leaders have gotten a little complacent. Those who were not in a moment of innovation, I think you're seeing leaders that have always been innovative, they didn't really have to adjust much. And so those organizations that were doing business as usual learned quickly that there is no such thing as business as usual, and that they had to rely on innovation to stay relevant. And innovation means getting ideas from many different places. And that's all levels, from the beginning of the organization, mid management, all the way through leadership. So leadership is taking on the responsibility, but the accountability really is coming from the rest of the organization.
You and I were talking last week, and you brought up a phrase that has been on my mind for the past week. And I think it really sums up what you and I are wanting organizations to understand. And that's compassion, not compliance.
That is correct.
So talk about it, explain what you mean by that, because I think it's really a very impactful statement.
Well, ironically, it happened almost by accident as I was sharing with someone, and I intentionally do this. I have conversation with people who have a different opinion about inclusion strategies. And during that, it wasn't that it got heated, but it got very emotional. And I said, the one thing that we all have in common and need to be able to do to move through change is compassion. And at that moment, it came to my realization that compliance is not really what this is about. The compliance is the checking the box that we referred to earlier on. That has never been enough. Going beyond that requires you to have an emotional skill set, an ability to communicate openly, an ability to hear opposite opinions and be able to disagree and understand conflict. And the compassion part is where you deal with the resolutions for conflict. The compassion part is where you understand the perspective of someone else. The compassion part is having a sense of, and I jokingly say that has now become part of what I believe in, is love. Love and compassion are really one and the same, and that is what's needed in a company. If people don't love their company culture, they will not stay. If people don't love the people that they work with, they will not stay. If people don't love their role, their task, their job, or even what the company stands for, it doesn't stay. And the only thing that connects us to one another is having a sense of love. And that's on the spectrum, obviously. It's a different kind of love than romantic love. It's a love for one another. And in Jamaica, we have this philosophy, and Bob Marley was a great example of it, of one love. We're all in this together.
You're right. People won't stay at an organization that they don't have love for. And whatever context that love comes about, whether it's love for your team, love for your product, love for your mission, what research shows is that more than 50% of people will leave an organization based on whether or not they feel like they are valued there. And there's that piece of value that comes along with love. And organizations have not really done a great job of figuring out that in Envision RISE, we talk about convergence and not conformance. And it's funny that our two organizations have phrases that have so many C's in them, but it's kind of the same thing, that we're asking you to come together. We're not asking you to toe a line. We're not asking you to change your values. We're not asking you to become a completely different person. We're asking you to come together. And that is one of the most important things that an organization can do. It's hard to do, though, especially if you do have a pretty diverse workforce. And like you said earlier, people are walking on eggshells. So what can we start doing as leaders, as individual contributors? What can people start taking to work with them that will help them come together, as opposed to feeling like I can't say anything, I'm going to hurt somebody's feelings, I'm going to get in trouble, I'm going to get fired?
You know, similar to a romantic relationship, the word compassion includes the biggest part of that word is the word passion. And so if you continue to figure out what's your whistle and what keeps you passionate about what you're doing, often at times that comes with feeling confident. When you're in a romantic relationship, when you feel confident, you're more willing to take chances and you're more willing to go through things together. And you actually feel more like a risk taker because you're so excited about it. And so finding what keeps you excited and allows your passion to continue to burn is part of your own self-awareness. Once you're well aware of who you are, then you know that you value yourself, and it's easier to recognize when you're not valued. And oftentimes companies lose people when people know who they are and have defined what their role is in that organization, and they're not given the opportunity to really work with people to show those strengths. And so I can tell you, I had an experience. I worked with an organization for 3 years, and I started to feel not necessarily invisible, but I didn't feel valued for what was unique about me that I brought to the table. Now, mind you, I was the only woman of color. Let me rephrase. I was the only Black woman at that time, but the organization itself was the cream of the crop, the top of the industry. And I wanted to be affiliated with that organization, but my insecurities didn't allow me to speak up for myself and bring what made me unique and different. So to be fair, I left knowing that I wanted to come back once I found the training and build my confidence. When I came back sharing what it is that I needed in order to be successful and whether or not that matched their needs, and coming up with a compromise. But it's really on you as an individual to determine who you are and finding your value. As a Black woman, I never wanted to bring up the fact that I was Black. Now it's obvious by looking at me, but I didn't want to be that person that was playing the Black card, that was always wanting to have an exception created for me, but I was the exception to the rule just by the nature of the demographics of the organization. And only when I had that confidence in myself and I was in love with myself and the work that I was doing, that I was able to define for someone else how we can work together, so that I was able to be a success in their world, and vice versa. They can understand what my world was, and then we can come together.
I want to talk about accountability because you kind of brought it up a little bit, that this is really on the individual, that this is not, and that's something that I think is missing in a lot of these conversations about feeling included at work. It's sort of, some people have kind of gotten this mindset of, well, they haven't invited me to the table. They haven't done what I need them to do. So I feel like I'm not important. And for those of us that are a little bit more introverted, that can be very real. And we do need to be mindful as leaders that not everybody's going to tell you what they need. But holding yourself accountable for speaking up for your needs is such a critical thing, because if you don't speak up, no one else is going to do it for you.
Correct. And sometimes it feels unfair because my colleagues don't have to speak up about what's obvious because they're all have so many similarities. Not that it's a kumbaya situation, but there's not this need to have to declare what's different about themselves.
Mhm.
It's a given. But when you start to grow in confidence, and this is true even as we mature in our industry, people switch industries and they're unsure of that industry, but at some point you become an expert, and then you are then defining what success looks like, and then you're holding the other person accountable. But until you feel that you've achieved some success, or you need to have tools to be successful, you won't be able to create a relationship that's positive. And it's, again, going back to romantic relationship, people often say, if you are not in love with yourself and if you're not a whole person, you cannot be completed by someone else. Your organization and the culture of your organization doesn't complete you. You have to be complete and full first. Now, in saying that, I sought out my mentors. I was very aggressive about it. People talk about the angry Black woman. I was angry that I didn't have the skills that I needed. I turned that into something that became eagerness. And then now I call myself the eager Black woman because I sought out mentors. Often people said they didn't have time. So that meant that I would get as much time as I can get or skill from them and find another mentor. I sought out the organization that was the top in the industry, and I forced myself onto them, so to speak, because I knew the information that I needed. The reverse was, everyone who is helping you wants to know what's in it for them. And what's in it for them is, I'm able to produce more. I'm able to show up differently. I'm able to represent the organization as who I am, and the organization is benefiting because now I'm attracting a different attention, different energy, a different clientele that may not existed before. And so the responsibility is on you, but you will also feel insecure if the organization gives you reasons for feeling insecure. And when people talk about the victim mentality when it comes to DEI, why are we making exceptions for you? Why do we have to make special arrangements for you? Sometimes it's as simple as, I had opportunity to have, well, let me rephrase this. There was marketing throughout the organization, and there were notepads, for example, and the organization had used the same printing company for years. And when the pictures came out, you couldn't see me. You could only see my teeth. Now, I'm a dark-skinned woman. And so when I asked them, at first, I just went along with it. As soon as I saw it, I had an immediate reaction. And I started realizing that it's on me to say that I'm not comfortable with handing somebody a product with only seeing my teeth when no one else had to make the change. When I brought it up, they said, we've used this manufacturer for 20 years. We've never had to make that change. We don't want to make that exception. And so immediately I felt guilty about that. But then the leader of the organization immediately said to them, because of our 20-year relationship, our expectations are that you will change and change the die lot to make this so that everyone feels included, so she can be seen on the piece of paper. I was very nervous about even asking that question, and I had to ask leadership. They end up changing the manufacturer because they said they would have to change their entire system because the machines that they were using didn't allow them to do that. And so the organization made that entire change based on meeting my needs, which ultimately helped them because I'm marketing their company as well. But it was very an uncomfortable feeling, but I felt confident at that point that I can contribute to this company and I should be able to have the same rights.
That's a really incredible story, actually, on a lot of levels, that the first reaction for some was, get over it. And this is your face out in the world. And
that represents their company.
So I'm glad that a leader stepped in and said, no, we're going to make this right, because while you may have only been the Black woman at the time, hopefully you aren't the last Black woman to work at that organization. And having someone else have that same experience would be then a pattern. So
Correct.
things happen, changes need to be made. when you choose not to make a change, you are making a choice about what your culture is, about how people can feel in your organization. That, I mean, imagine headshots of the executive team and you can't see their faces. That wouldn't happen.
And
So
it's
the idea.
actually very common for me even today as a speaker.
Mhm.
When I go on stage and I have to request the AV team to adjust the lighting, some get very perturbed and annoyed. When I have to ask for a microphone that comes onto my side of my face that's bright peach and my
Mhm.
face is dark, and I ask if they have a different microphone, I become a burden or a diva. And so going on to stage, you're already feeling like you're burdening the AV team, that you are a nuisance. And it changes your mindset of how usually when you get on stage, you're pumping yourself up, you're getting excited, you have to be the most confident you ever are. The last thing you want to think of is, I am a burden to everyone else. Now, same is true. I have learned to be proactive and say, before I get to the venue, that there are some things that are required. And if I need to bring my own, I will. I always come with my own. It doesn't always work with the AV team, but it's my responsibility, just as it is a vegan or someone else, to be prepared and be proactive about it. But I also know that it's on me, because not everybody knows to have a different color microphone. Oftentimes they'll say, you're the first person that has ever asked that. And usually they're willing to change it. And that change becomes beneficial, because now other people who come don't feel that way.
Mhm.
And I'll say the leadership does matter, because the leadership ultimately is going to decide the budget. That was a financial decision that they made by having to switch companies, to end up going with a different direction. It changed it, and it had to happen before the next time they went to print something again. So that there was due diligence that was required. The marketing team had to change, had to do the research for the company. It required a lot of extra work. I'll tell you now that I eventually became one of their top producers. I eventually became one of the people that represented the organization for what was different. So they invested in me there. And then 10 years later, that the results were that production. But that leader was also the person who hired me years ago.
Mhm.
And when they hired me, they hadn't hired a rookie, and they said, you're going to have to learn on your own. And I had to be willing to teach myself. And so that person had the mindset before, they didn't have to exercise it until that situation came up.
So what I hear you talking about is the other side of having a strategic workplace culture, and that is each individual being strategic about their own growth, about what they want and need for their career. You mentioned it in finding mentors, that it wasn't a matter of sitting back and waiting for the company to say, hey, Lori, we got you this mentor. And I think so many times for organizations that are trying mentorship or sponsorship for the first time in their organization, they give up quickly because they think, well, it didn't work.
Yes. And that
And
happened the last couple of years. They hired all the people that checked the box, all the demographics.
yep.
And they said, well, they're not successful. And it's been 9 months or a year, when many people have the luxury of having their whole career to get to that point.
Mm-hmm. Yep. That's another thing that I know when I work with leadership teams and executive teams on getting aligned, that this is not going to work if they think that they can just be directive from the top down and say, do this.
Yes.
There's got to be room for individuals to speak up and say, I have feedback. This isn't working. And here's my insight on that. And I know leadership culture is sort of, don't come to me up with a problem if you don't have a solution. And maybe you do have a solution. But I also find that to be very short-sighted of leadership, because that to me sounds like we don't want to engage with you to problem solve together. Instead, it sounds like, well, tell us what we're doing wrong then. And it's
Right.
sort of that a little bit of defiant of, you think you're so smart. And what's your idea?
And even as you say that, we're speaking now under the assumption that the leadership that we're referring to are not prepared for change. The other
Mm-hmm.
solution is creating new leaders.
Mm-hmm.
Developing new leaders so that they are naturally, my mindset of always looking through things in a different perspective, meaning my own perspective. As I became a leader in the organization, I had more influence in the decisions that were made. And that leadership became, I created my own lane. I found an area of leadership that I could lead based on my perspective that no one else had. So that became an asset because I was now bringing something that had never been there before. And the man who hired me was an older white man. And right now, a lot of the frustration with older white men who have been in leadership for a while is I'm not even being invited to the table. You know, you're saying that you're not invited to the table. Well, I also am not invited to the conversation, and I'm already at the table. And so having those conversations, the dialogue of me teaching, you know, the mentor sometimes becomes the mentee and the mentee becomes the mentor. You and I have talked about reverse mentorship. That goes with inclusion as well. If you have been in a position of power and have been able to be successful, wildly successful, and many people made more money than they've ever made before, and they're thinking, I'm not having an issue with loss. Why do I need to change? But the truth of the matter is we know that change is simultaneously happening with innovation. And once they find out what the issue is, I love talking to organizations who are against DEI because there's so many golden nuggets when I find out what is your frustration, not the fear, because people always get defensive when we talk about you're afraid of. It's not always fear-based. It's just the unknown. And the unknown is what brought most of those organizations to success because they explored the unknown with their product or their services and became unique. So if we look at alignment, as you said, in that way, where I'm having conversation and dialogue in a friendly way, then we no longer are being combative and we're no longer having to deal with conflict. We are simply compromising at that point.
Adam Grant wrote in one of his books that you should be having conflict at work, but that conflict should be surrounding work, not surrounding personal things, whether that's in regard to diversity or if that's in regard to just two people not getting along. That's not healthy conflict, but that there should absolutely be disagreement at work. And the way that you get to that point is through respecting one another. And if you can't even have a conversation with each other, how are you even going to get to respect?
So true. And I have to tell you, I had conflict with myself because I was wondering, when is it appropriate to say this is wrong? Because am I now creating career suicide? When is it okay to say that? For me, for example, being in the real estate industry, I was in the real estate industry, and there were times where was I Lori the mom, Lori the Black woman, Lori the realtor, Lori the professional? Sometimes all of those blend, and I don't always have a choice to separate my personal from my professional. And oftentimes other people have the advantage of doing that. And I think women and men and those who identify themselves as neither are faced with their personal as part of their professional. Because when I wake up and I'm going to an environment where I know ahead of time I'm the only, I literally have to pump myself up and get excited about I'm there to learn, not focusing on the fact that when they're talking about we, that sometimes that we does not include me, because when they're giving examples of when we do this and they do that, sometimes I'm the they. And I'm in the room with the we's, and it's on me to make people aware of I am part of the we. That dialogue, that terminology has to change, because many times the them and the they is me. And when you're in a comfortable situation or company that recognize that and is empathetic to that, that's the compassion part. They start asking questions more, and they not necessarily accommodate you, but they work with you.
That we part is so important because that is probably the biggest change that we are going to see in the next 15, 20 years, is that the makeup of we is changing. We've got all the baby boomers meeting traditional retirement age of 65 in just 6 years, 2030. All the baby boomers are going to be 65 or older. Then they're followed by a much smaller generation with Gen X. There are not nearly enough Gen X workers to fill the roles that are being left by the retiring baby boomers. And then you've got the millennials, which are a larger population, but probably one of the more diverse populations that we've seen in a while. And then we get to Gen Z, where our kids are. And that is the most diverse population yet.
Absolutely.
When we get to like 2045, somewhere in there, the United States will be a majority minority country. and some states are already there. So like California, New Mexico, places like that.
And globally, we've been there.
Yes,
We've been there
globally, we're
for
already
years.
there.
We're just
Yep.
now acknowledging it. And
Yep.
the we now here, and I'm talking about here being the United States, is a
Mhm.
global mindset. So now, and COVID was the perfect example of me versus we. The entire world was facing the same issue, and we became a we. Countries were relying on each other for research and development. They were relying on each other for execution. It became crystal clear that the world relies on one another. And when I talk about that one love concept, is that we became one as a globe. And it didn't matter what country people came from. It didn't even matter the politics. People were trying to save people from dying. And death was the motivator, and a solution was the motivator. And that became the we of us all. And it is really important for people to understand that we is fluid. You know, our company, Changing Paces International, became a we because I started talking about multiculturalism and multi-generation. And it sounds funny because it's a mouthful when you say the two, but add in AI, the areas where we have gaps, AI is able to create we in seconds. They can figure out a solution that takes in consideration different mindsets, different technology, different demographics. And the flip to that is AI is based on information in, information out. So as we gather information and we're seeing things more collectively, that gap that we're missing when the baby boomers move out is being replaced by AI. And so us working with AI is yet another change. And we'll talk about that in the future. But AI is going to have a huge impact in how we deal with inclusion.
I'm going to not dive into the AI right now because I know you and I are going to talk about it in a future episode. And it's so important to this entire conversation about workplace culture.
Yes.
So at this point, I would like to leave our audience with a couple of things to think about. First of all, I hope that our listeners will be thinking a bit about compassion, not compliance, and how they can bring that to the workplace. And I also hope that they will be thinking about it as convergence and not conformance, that those are two related but different concepts, but both are critically important to whatever strategic changes you are trying to make, especially when it comes to culture.
Yes. And I think what conversion is about change, and compassion is about continuing to manage change. And both of them are about movement. You know, love is not stagnant. It's constantly going through the ebb and flows of change and being able to meet people where they are and understanding who you are. And I think the benefit that you and I have, and I'll wrap up by saying this, I remember when we were talking about our kids, I was wondering, you at the time were the only white woman on the committee. Then you shared with me that you were in the same industry I was with DEI. And I wanted to know, well, what's the catch? What was your interest? What motivates you? What inspires you? And I think what we've discovered is that you can be compassionate about something that you don't know what it's like to be in my shoes. I don't know what it's like to be in your shoes. And that is what we had in common, is how can we help people who have different mindsets and different perceptions and different perspectives. A lot of people that do DEI work, everyone on their team looks like them. And the irony is they're trying to get organizations to be more diverse. What you and I have recognized right off the bat is that we come from different worlds, different perspectives, and that's what makes our conversations unique, because we're looking at what's different and what's we have in common as the same.
And that is absolutely our goal of our strategic partnership, of this podcast, of the keynotes you and I will be doing together, that we want to show the example that the woman from Jamaica and the woman from Western Pennsylvania can absolutely have these conversations together and work towards figuring out how to get everybody else on board and not give up who you are, not give up your values, but to still create a feeling of inclusion and belonging within your workforce that benefits everybody.
Absolutely. And let me say this as well. We have something that's also unique, is that we both are children's fathers. Your children's father is a white man. My children's father is a Black man. We have also seen their pain, and we've also seen their privileges from those roles. So we are bringing to the table our conversations, our conflicts, our resolutions with dealing with men who also represent different demographics. And
Mhm.
so I don't think that many people talk about that. Who they are has to do with who they deal with daily, who they love,
Yeah.
who they have conflict with. And so I constantly would ask my children's father what he was thinking. And when George Floyd, unfortunately, was murdered, we had very different perspectives,
Mhm.
very different opinions, and very different approaches to how to deal with it with our children. And that's true in corporate America. Everyone's approach will be different, but I had to ask the question because I wasn't feeling what he was feeling, even though we were both Black. We had very different perspectives. And I think that same is true. I'm benefiting from you having a relationship with a white male and understanding that perspective as well.
It's all about perspective, and it's all about being able to communicate with each other in a way that values one another. And it's okay to have a difference of opinion.
In fact, it's
Laura,
great when you do.
wait, we want a difference of opinion, right? Lori, where can our listeners find out more about Changing Paces International?
So you can find out about Changing Paces International at loripace.com. And on that website, as we start to develop new programs and talk about things that have been changing in the country, we will continue to provide information, tools, and training opportunities there.
And you can also look for us at envisionrise.com for Envision Rise information, as well as our continuing conversations between myself and Lori. Lori, it was great to spend time with you. We will be doing more episodes throughout the year and tackling more topics. If there are topics our listeners would like to see Lori and I talk about, feel free to fill out the information page on envisionrise.com and we will try to address it. Thanks, Lori.
Thank you.
Thank you so much for listening to today's episode. And so with your help, we can get this message to more people. Subscribe, rate, and review the show, and be a part of making a difference, because it starts with you.